The morning arrived, wrapped in gray silk, the kind of mist that turns mansions into ghosts of themselves. Emily Harrison stood at the wrought iron gates of the Grant estate, her breath forming small clouds in the February cold. The house beyond rose like something from another century, all limestone and leaded glass, its windows dark except for one, a single light burning in what must have been the kitchen. She had arrived 15 minutes early for the interview, a habit formed from years of needing every job more than the job needed her. The classified ad had been sparse on details. Live. In nanny needed for special circumstances. Experience with childhood trauma preferred. Generous compensation. It was the word generous that had caught her attention, but it was special circumstances that had made her wary. The gates opened with a mechanical whisper, and she walked the long driveway lined with bare oak trees, their branches creating a lattice of shadows against the pale morning sky. The front door opened before she could ring the bell. A woman in her 60s, wearing a crisp uniform, assessed her with tired eyes. "Miss Harrison? Mr. Grant is waiting in the study. Please follow me." The interior was all marble and mahogany, beautiful in the way museums are beautiful, meant to be admired, but not touched. Family portraits lined the hallway, but Emily noticed they stopped abruptly 3 years ago, as if time itself had been suspended. The study door was ajar, and through it came the sound of papers shuffling. A pen scratching against expensive paper. Alexander Grant didn't look up when she entered. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of premature gray that comes from grief rather than genetics. His suit was impeccable, but there were shadows under his eyes that no amount of money could erase. "Miss Harrison," he said finally, setting down his pen with deliberate precision, "tell me why you think you're qualified to care for a child who hasn't spoken in 3 years." The question hung in the air between them, sharp as winter frost. Emily had prepared for many questions, but not for such immediate honesty. She sat down without being invited, something that made him finally look at her directly. "Because I understand that silence isn't always empty," she said. "Sometimes it's the only safe place a child has left." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with the intensity of someone who had learned to read people like contracts. "Lucas witnessed his mother's death," Alexander said. The words coming out mechanical, rehearsed. "A sailing accident. He was with her when the boat capsized. She managed to get him to safety, but He stopped, his jaw tightening. "He hasn't spoken since. 3 nannies have quit. The last one lasted 4 days." Emily absorbed this information, feeling the weight of it settle into her bones. She thought of her own losses, the holes they had left in her life. How sometimes trauma became a language all its own. "May I meet him?" she asked. Alexander's surprise was evident. Most applicants wanted to discuss salary, benefits, responsibilities. "He's in the conservatory," he said after a long pause. "But I should warn you. He won't acknowledge you. He doesn't acknowledge anyone anymore." Emily stood, smoothing her simple dress. "That's all right. Sometimes being seen is enough, even if we're not acknowledged." Alexander gestured toward the hallway, and she could feel his eyes on her back as she walked away, probably already calculating how long she would last. The conservatory was a glass cathedral attached to the east wing of the house, filled with tropical plants that seemed to breathe in the humid air. She found Lucas among the orchids, a small figure dressed in navy blue, sitting perfectly still on a wooden bench. He was 7, according to the file she'd been sent, but grief had made him seem both older and younger simultaneously. His dark hair fell across his forehead, and his hands were folded in his lap with an adult's careful precision. He didn't look up when she approached, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. Emily didn't speak. Instead, she sat on the far end of the bench, leaving plenty of space between them. She pulled a small sketchbook from her bag and began to draw, her pencil moving in gentle strokes across the paper. She drew what she saw the curve of an orchid petal, the way light filtered through the glass ceiling, the pattern of shadows on the tiled floor. Minutes passed, perhaps 10, perhaps 20. Lucas remained motionless, but she could feel his awareness, the way his stillness had shifted from absence to attention. When she finally stood to leave, she left the sketch on the bench, a small bird perched on an orchid stem. its head tilted as if listening for something just beyond hearing. That evening, Alexander called. His voice was different over the phone, less controlled, more human. "The sketch you left," he said. Lucas carried it to his room. He's never done that before. Not with anything the other nannies tried. Emily held the phone against her ear, looking out the window of her small apartment at the city lights below. "When would you like me to start?" she asked. There was a pause, and she could hear him breathing, making a decision that was about more than just hiring help. "Tomorrow," he said. "If that's not too soon." Emily looked around her apartment, at the boxes she'd never fully unpacked since moving here, at the life she'd held in suspension since her own losses. "Tomorrow is perfect," she said. The first week was an exercise in patience. Emily arrived each morning at 7, before Lucas woke, and spent her time learning the rhythms of the house. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, showed her the routine's breakfast at 8, always the same. Toast with jam, orange juice, scrambled eggs, that Lucas would push around his plate but rarely eat. Alexander left for his office by 7:30, returning after Lucas was in bed. It was a house running on autopilot, each person moving through their designated spaces, without truly inhabiting them. Lucas avoided her with the skill of someone who had made himself invisible. He would enter a room, see her, and simply turn around. During meals, he kept his eyes fixed on his plate. When she read aloud in the library, choosing books she'd loved as a child, he would sometimes pause outside the door, a shadow glimpsed in peripheral vision, but he never came in. Emily didn't push. She had learned long ago that healing couldn't be forced, that trust was built in moments so small they might be mistaken for nothing at all. She began leaving small offerings, like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale, a piece of sea glass on his windowsill, a paper crane on his pillow, a drawing of a sailboat with its sails full of stars instead of wind. Each morning, the previous day's offering would be gone, tucked away somewhere she couldn't see. Mrs. Chen mentioned finding them in Lucas's treasure box, a wooden chest his mother had given him that he kept under his bed. "He's protecting them," the older woman said, and there was hope in her voice for the first time. The breakthrough came, as breakthroughs often do, through accident rather than design. Emily had been trying to reach a book on a high shelf in the library, stretching on her tiptoes, when the step stool slipped. She fell, not dramatically, but hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. She lay on the carpet, catching her breath, when she heard footsteps, small, hesitant, approaching. Lucas appeared in the doorway, his face showing the first emotion she'd seen: concern. He didn't come closer, but he didn't leave either. "I'm okay," she said softly, sitting up slowly. "Just clumsy." Something shifted in his expression, and for a moment, she thought he might speak. Instead, he disappeared, returning moments later with a glass of water, which he set on the floor just within her reach before retreating again. That evening, Alexander found her in the kitchen, making tea. "Mrs. Chen told me what happened," he said. "About Lucas bringing you water." Emily nodded, adding honey to her cup. "He's a caring child. That hasn't gone away. It's just hidden." Alexander poured himself coffee, though it was past 9. She noticed he did that often, choosing stimulants over sleep. "His mother used to say the same thing," he said quietly. She could see the best in everyone. The grief in his voice was so raw, it made Emily's chest tight. "Tell me about her," she said, surprising them both. Alexander talked for an hour, maybe more. About Margaret, who had grown up on the coast of Maine, who could sail before she could ride a bike, who had married him despite his family's concerns about her humble background, who had filled this massive house with laughter and chaos and love, who had taught Lucas to find shapes in clouds and stories in stars, who had died saving their son, making a choice no parent should have to make. "I wasn't there," he said, his voice breaking. "I was in Hong Kong, closing a deal that seems so meaningless now. She died alone. And Lucas." He stopped, unable to continue. Emily wanted to offer comfort, but she knew sometimes grief needed space to exist without consolation. "Instead," she said, "Lucas wasn't alone. He had her until the very end. That's what he's carrying. Not just the trauma, but the love. They're twisted together now, and he doesn't know how to have one without the other. Alexander looked at her with something like recognition. "You've lost someone," he said. It wasn't a question. Emily nodded. "My daughter. Cancer. She was 5. The words came out simple, matter-of-fact, but they carried years of pain compressed into syllables. The second week brought subtle changes. Lucas began staying in rooms when she entered, though he kept his distance. During her reading sessions, he moved from the hallway to just inside the door, sitting with his back against the wall where she could barely see him. She never acknowledged his presence directly, just kept reading, her voice steady and warm. She chose stories carefully, tales of journeys and returns, of lost things found, of courage in small doses. One afternoon, she found him in the conservatory, with a handful of crayons and paper, drawing intently. She sat at the other end of the room with her own sketchbook, and they drew in companionable silence. When she eventually looked at what he'd created, her breath caught. The page was filled with water waves and waves of blue and gray and green, with a small figure floating in the center. But the figure wasn't drowning. They were surrounded by light, lifted by it. It was loss and salvation combined. A child's attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable. She began incorporating the ocean into her offerings. Shells arranged in patterns on his desk. A mobile made from driftwood and fishing line. A book about lighthouses, their beacons cutting through darkness. Lucas collected each one, and slowly, incrementally, he began leaving things for her in return. A blue feather. A smooth stone. A drawing of 2 figures sitting on a bench, one large, one small, both facing the same direction. The power outage happened on a Thursday evening. A spring storm had rolled in, fierce and sudden, knocking out electricity to half the county. Emily found Lucas in the living room, standing by the window, watching the lightning illuminate the sky in violent bursts. His small body was rigid with fear, and she could see him trembling. Without thinking, she began to hum a lullaby her grandmother had sung, something about boats and harbors and safe returns. She didn't approach him, just sat on the couch and continued humming, low and steady. After a few minutes, Lucas moved away from the window, not to her, but closer, settling on the far end of the couch. The humming continued, and gradually his trembling eased. When a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the house, he slid closer, just inches. But it was a mile in terms of trust. Emily pulled a blanket from the back of the couch and draped it over her shoulders, leaving half of it extended. An invitation without words. Lucas didn't take it, but he didn't move away either. Alexander found them there an hour later when he arrived home, soaked from rain. Lucas was asleep, having gradually migrated until he was leaning against Emily's shoulder, the first voluntary physical contact he'd made with anyone since his mother's death. Alexander stood in the doorway, water dripping from his coat, his expression unreadable. Emily met his eyes over Lucas's head, and something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a threshold crossed. That night, after Lucas was in bed, Alexander asked her to stay for dinner. They ate in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, soup and bread, simple food that Mrs. Chen had left. "He looks peaceful when he sleeps now," Alexander said. Before, even unconscious, he seemed to be fighting something. Emily understood. She'd seen the same thing in her daughter during treatment. The way illness invaded, even dreams. "Fighting takes so much energy," she said. "Sometimes the bravest thing is to stop fighting and just be held." Alexander studied her across the table. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "The agency said you had experience with special needs children. But your approach, it's different." Emily smiled slightly. "I don't see Lucas as special needs. I see him as a child who's protecting himself the only way he knows how. My job isn't to fix him or force him to be who he was before. It's to show him that it's safe to be who he is now." Alexander's eyes glistened, and he looked away, composing himself. "Margaret would have liked you," he said quietly. The third week brought a new routine. Lucas began joining Emily for meals, though he still didn't eat much. He would sit at the table, moving food around his plate, occasionally taking small bites when he thought no one was looking. Emily started making smoothies, leaving them within reach, and often they would disappear when her back was turned. Nutrition disguised as neglect. Care that didn't demand acknowledgement. She introduced activities that didn't require speech but invited participation. Puzzles spread across the library floor. Watercolors in the conservatory, planting seeds in small pots, watching for the first green shoots. Lucas engaged with each activity sideways, never directly. He would add pieces to the puzzle when she stepped away. His paintings would appear next to hers, unnamed but expressive. He watered the seeds with religious dedication, measuring growth in millimeters. One morning, she found him in the conservatory earlier than usual, staring at one of the seedlings that had sprouted overnight. His face held wonder, the kind of pure amazement that belonged to childhood. Without thinking, Emily said, "It's like magic, isn't it?" Lucas turned to look at her, and for a moment she thought he might speak. Instead, he nodded, the first direct response he'd given to anyone. It was a small gesture, but in the economy of trauma, it was wealth beyond measure. Alexander witnessed more of these moments as he began coming home earlier, drawn by reports from Mrs. Chen about the changes in his son. He would stand in doorways, watching Lucas and Emily work on their various projects. His expression a mixture of hope and something like envy. One evening, Emily invited him to join them in making paper boats to float in the fountain. He hesitated. This man who commanded boardrooms and negotiations, uncertain in the face of simple play. But Lucas looked at him, a clear invitation in his eyes, and Alexander sat on the floor in his expensive suit, folding paper with uncertain fingers. The boats were imperfect. Alexander's too rigid, Emily's lopsided, Lucas's surprisingly elegant. They carried them outside together, a small procession in the dying light. The fountain was still, and the paper boat sat on its surface like prayers. Lucas placed his in the water with particular care, then looked at his father, waiting. Alexander understood, and placed his boat next to his son's. Emily added hers, and they stood together, watching the small fleet bob gently. No one spoke, but the silence was full rather than empty, connected rather than isolated. That night, Lucas had a nightmare. Emily heard him from her room down the hall, not screaming, but making small, wounded sounds that were somehow worse. She found him tangled in his sheets, his face wet with tears. Still asleep, but fighting invisible currents. She sat on the edge of his bed, not touching him but present, and began to tell a story, not reading from a book, but weaving something new, about a boy who could breathe underwater, who could swim with stars, whose mother had become part of the ocean itself, always there in every wave and tide. Lucas's breathing steadied, his body relaxing. His eyes opened, focused on her face in the darkness. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he spoke his first word in 3 years. More. Emily's heart cracked and mended simultaneously. She continued the story, her voice steady despite the tears on her own cheeks, until Lucas fell back asleep, his hand finding hers across the blanket, holding on as if she were an anchor in calm seas. Alexander had heard everything from the hallway. When Emily finally emerged from Lucas's room, she found him sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, the kind of crying that comes from holding too much for too long. Emily sat beside him, not speaking, just present. After a while, he said, "I didn't think I'd ever hear his voice again." Emily understood the weight of that fear, the way hope could feel more dangerous than despair. "He's finding his way back," she said. "Not to who he was, but to who he's becoming." The next morning, Lucas spoke again. Just single words, "Juice. Please, Bird." But each one was a small victory. Alexander called in sick to work for the first time anyone could remember, spending the day simply being present, watching his son rediscover language. Lucas seemed to test each word carefully, as if checking whether they still worked, whether they were safe to use. By afternoon, he was stringing 2 words together. More juice. Pretty flower. Where's Emily? That last question, when Emily had stepped out to get lunch, made Alexander's chest tight. His son had not only found his voice, but had found someone worth using it for. When Emily returned, Lucas ran to her. Actually ran and said, "You came back." 3 words that held 3 years of fear. Emily knelt to his level, meeting his eyes. "Always," she said, and meant it. The 4th week brought sentences, halting at first, then with growing confidence. Lucas began narrating his activities. "I'm drawing a boat. The seed is growing. Dad is home." That last observation, made one evening when Alexander arrived, stopped everyone in their tracks. It had been father before, formal and distant. Dad was warm, familiar. A bridge rebuilt. Alexander had to turn away, overwhelmed. But Lucas followed him, tugging on his sleeve. "Dad, see my picture?" The picture was of 3 figures in a garden, clearly meant to be the 3 of them, surrounded by enormous flowers and improbable butterflies. But in the corner, barely visible, was a 4th figure made of light and water, watching over them. Margaret, perhaps, or the idea of her, integrated into the landscape of their continuing life. Alexander knelt beside his son, studying the picture with the attention it deserved. "It's beautiful," he said. "Tell me about it." And Lucas did, words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. 3 years of observations and thoughts and feelings, finally finding expression. But healing, Emily knew, was rarely linear. The progress brought its own challenges. As Lucas began to speak more, he also began to process what had happened, asking questions that had no easy answers. Why didn't Mommy swim to safety too? Where do people go when they die? Will you die, Emily? Each question was a small devastation, requiring honesty without despair, truth without trauma. Emily answered as best she could, often with, "I don't know when that was the truest response." Alexander struggled with the questions too, his composure cracking as Lucas's emotional dam broke. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation about whether Mommy was cold in the ocean, Alexander retreated to his study. Emily found him there later, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk, staring at a photo of Margaret. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "She was the one who knew how to talk to him about difficult things. I work. That's what I know how to do." Emily sat across from him. "You're learning," she said. "Just like Lucas is learning to speak again, you're learning to be present. It's not about having perfect answers. It's about being willing to sit with the questions." Alexander looked at her, this woman who had appeared in their lives like a life raft. "How do you know so much about loss?" he asked. Emily considered the question. "Because I've learned that loss isn't something you get over. It's something you grow around. Like a tree growing around a fence. The fence becomes part of the tree, but the tree keeps growing. As spring deepened, so did the connections between them. Lucas began to show affection, physically hugs that started tentative and grew fierce, holding Emily's hand during walks, climbing into his father's lap during evening reading. The house, which had felt like a mausoleum when Emily first arrived, began to feel alive again. Laughter returned, startling at first, then more natural. Mrs. Chen commented that it was like watching a photograph develop, the family coming into focus. But in late April, Alexander received an offer that threatened the fragile ecosystem they'd built. A specialist in Switzerland, someone who worked exclusively with traumatized children, had agreed to take Lucas as a patient. It would mean 6 months abroad, intensive therapy, the best care money could buy. Alexander presented it to Emily as a fait accompli, already making arrangements. "It's what's best for him," he said. But his voice held uncertainty. Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Best according to whom?" she asked. Alexander bristled at the challenge. "According to experts. People with degrees and decades of experience." Emily stood, something flaring in her usually calm demeanor. "Lucas isn't a problem to be solved by experts. He's a child who's learning to trust again. Sending him away now, just when he's opening up, could undo everything. The argument escalated, voices raised for the first time since Emily had arrived. Neither noticed Lucas standing in the doorway until they heard his small voice. "I don't want to go away." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas looked between them, his face crumpling. "Don't send me away, Dad. I'll be good. I'll talk more. I promise." The words came out in a rush, panic rising. He ran to Emily, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Don't let him send me away." Alexander stood frozen, seeing his son's fear, understanding suddenly how the offer of help could feel like abandonment. He knelt beside Lucas, his hands tentative. "I'm not sending you away," he said, his voice rough. "I was trying to help. But I didn't think." Lucas turned to his father, still holding on to Emily. "I don't need to go away to get better. I'm getting better here. With Emily. With you." The simple truth of it broke something in Alexander. He pulled Lucas into his arms, holding him the way he hadn't since Margaret died, afraid of breaking something that was already broken. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay. You're staying here. We're all staying here." That night, after Lucas was asleep, Alexander found Emily in the garden. She was planting night-blooming jasmine, working by moonlight. "I owe you an apology," he said. She didn't look up, her hands continuing their work. "You owe Lucas an apology. I'm just the nanny." The words stung because they weren't true anymore, and they both knew it. She was far more than that now, woven into the fabric of their recovering family. "You're right," Alexander said. "But that's not what I mean. Margaret would be grateful. For what you've done for Lucas. For what you've done for both of us." Emily finally looked at him, dirt on her hands, her face illuminated by the moon. "I'm not trying to replace her," she said quietly. Alexander moved closer, sitting on the garden wall. "I know. That's not what this is. But you've brought something back that I thought was gone forever. Not just Lucas's voice, but life. The possibility of life after loss." Emily returned to her planting, but her movements were gentler. "Loss changes us," she said, "but it doesn't have to define us. Your son taught me that. He's braver than you know." May arrived with unexpected warmth. Lucas was speaking in full paragraphs now, his thoughts tumbling out as if making up for lost time. He told stories about his dreams, about the flowers in the conservatory, about the way clouds looked like his mother's smile. That last observation, made casually over breakfast, showed how he was integrating his grief, making it part of his story rather than the whole story. Alexander had started working from home more often, joining them for lunch, learning to be present in ways that quarterly reports had never taught him. One afternoon, Emily suggested they create a memory garden for Margaret. A place where they could remember her without the weight of loss. Celebrate who she had been rather than mourn who she wasn't. Lucas lit up at the idea, immediately planning what flowers to plant, where to put a bench, how to arrange stones in patterns Margaret would have loved. Alexander was quieter but agreed, understanding the importance of giving grief a physical space, somewhere it could be visited rather than carried everywhere. They worked on the garden together through May, each contributing something. Alexander had a small fountain installed, the sound of water a constant, soothing presence. Lucas chose flowers in every shade of blue, Mommy's favorite color, he explained. Emily added wind chimes made from sea glass, their gentle music a reminder that beautiful things could come from being tumbled by waves. Mrs. Chen contributed herbs that Margaret had loved to cook with, practical beauty that would have made her smile. The dedication of the garden happened on a Sunday, just the three of them. Lucas had made a sign, "Mommy's Garden, where love grows." He read a poem he'd written. Simple words about missing someone but being okay, about how love doesn't die even when people do. Alexander spoke about Margaret's laugh, how it could fill a room, how he heard it sometimes in Lucas's giggle. Emily sang the lullaby she'd hummed during the storm, her voice carrying across the garden, weaving them together in shared remembrance. After the dedication, Lucas took his father's hand and Emily's, standing between them. "Mommy would be happy," he said with the certainty children possess about important truths. She'd be happy we're not sad all the time anymore. Alexander squeezed his son's hand, unable to speak. Emily felt the weight of the moment, the way grief and joy could exist simultaneously, neither canceling the other. They stood together in the garden, three people who had found each other in loss and chosen to grow toward light. That evening, as Emily was preparing to go to her room, Alexander stopped her. "I need to ask you something," he said, uncharacteristically nervous. Lucas was already asleep, worn out from the emotional day. "The position," Alexander continued, "it was supposed to be temporary, until Lucas was speaking again, until things were stable." Emily felt her heart sink, already preparing for goodbye. "But that's not what this is anymore," Alexander continued quickly. "You're family now. Lucas needs you. We both do. I'd like to make your position permanent, if you're willing. Not just as a nanny, but as family." Emily felt tears threaten, thinking of her small apartment, the life she'd held in suspension, the way this house had become home without her noticing. "Yes," she said simply. Alexander's relief was visible, tension leaving his shoulders. "There's one more thing," he said. "Lucas has been asking if you could adopt him too. Not legally, of course, but in his heart. He wants to know if it's okay to love you like a mother, even though he had one already." Emily's tears came then, unstoppable. "He can love as many people as his heart can hold," she said. "That's what hearts are for." The next morning, Lucas woke early and found Emily in the kitchen, making breakfast. "Dad said you're staying forever," he announced, climbing onto a stool. Emily smiled, cracking eggs into a bowl. "Is that okay with you?" she asked. Lucas nodded emphatically. "More than okay. It's perfect." He paused, then added, "Can I tell you a secret?" Emily leaned closer, and Lucas whispered, "Sometimes I call you Mom in my head. Is that bad?" Emily pulled him into a hug, fierce and protective. "That's not bad at all," she whispered back. "That's beautiful." Summer arrived in full bloom, the garden Margaret's memory inhabited growing lush and wild. Lucas had become chatty, filling silences with observations and questions and stories. Alexander had learned to leave work at work, to be present for bedtime stories and morning pancakes. Emily had officially moved from the staff quarters to a room in the main house, her presence no longer that of an employee, but of someone essential. The house that had been a monument to grief had become something else. A place where broken things could heal, where love could take new forms without betraying old ones. One evening in late June, as they sat in Margaret's garden watching fireflies dance in the dusk, Lucas said something that summarized their journey. "We're different now, but we're okay." Alexander and Emily exchanged glances over his head, understanding flowing between them. They were different. The people they'd been before loss had been transformed, not restored. But in that transformation, they'd found something unexpected. Not a return to happiness, but an arrival at a new kind of wholeness. As the fireflies rose into the darkening sky, Lucas began to tell a story about a boy who could speak to stars, who had learned their language during a long silence. The stars had taught him, he said, that light travels even through darkness, that it just takes time to be seen. Alexander reached for Emily's hand, a gesture of gratitude and connection. She squeezed back, understanding. They sat together in the garden where love grew. Three people who had found in each other not a cure for loss, but a reason to keep growing despite it. Toward light, toward life, toward the infinite possibility of love that expands rather than replaces. The night deepened around them, but they weren't ready to go inside yet. Lucas had fallen asleep against Emily's shoulder, his breathing deep and untroubled. Alexander watched them, his son and this woman who had walked into their lives and chosen to stay, who had seen their brokenness and hadn't tried to fix it, but had simply sat with them in it until they were ready to heal. "Thank you," he said into the darkness. Emily understood he wasn't just thanking her for Lucas, but for showing him that life after devastating loss was possible, that love wasn't a finite resource that could be used up or lost at sea. The stars Lucas had been talking to emerged one by one, filling the sky with ancient light. In the garden, the night-blooming jasmine Emily had planted began to open, its fragrance mixing with the sound of the fountain, the whisper of wind chimes, the quiet breathing of a child who had found his voice again. It was a moment of perfect suspension, where grief and joy balanced exactly, where the past and future met in a present, made bearable by shared humanity. Alexander stood frozen, seeing his son's fear, understanding suddenly how the offer of help could feel like abandonment. He knelt beside Lucas, his hands tentative. "I'm not sending you away," he said, his voice rough. "I was trying to help, but I didn't think." Lucas turned to his father, still holding on to Emily. "I don't need to go away to get better. I'm getting better here. With Emily. With you." The simple truth of it broke something in Alexander.